The rain came down in sheets that October afternoon, turning the concrete outside Riverside Women's Correctional into a mirror of gray sky and chain-link fence. Marlo Reed stood just beyond the gate, 23 years old, holding a worn duffel bag that contained everything she owned in the world. 3 t-shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, underwear that had been washed so many times the elastic barely held, a toothbrush, and $47 in bills that had been returned to her from the property office, money she'd had in her pocket the night everything went wrong. The gate clanged shut behind her with a finality that should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like being cut loose from a life raft in the middle of the ocean. At least in that cell, she'd known where she'd sleep tonight. Out here, the world stretched in every direction with no road signs pointing toward anything that resembled a future. She'd spent 3 years behind those walls for a crime she didn't commit. Her best friend Megan had needed someone to take the fall for a breaking and entering charge. And Marlo had been young enough, stupid enough, loyal enough to believe that protecting Megan's little sister from the foster system was worth the sacrifice. The public defender had advised her to take the plea deal, 5 years reduced to 3 with good behavior. She'd served every day of those 3 years learning that loyalty was a currency that bought nothing but regret. The bus stop was 2 miles down the road. Marlo started walking, her sneakers squelching through puddles, her hair plastered to her skull. She didn't own an umbrella, didn't own much of anything anymore. The house where she'd grown up had been sold years before she went to prison, after her parents died in a car accident when she was 6. She'd bounced through 11 different foster homes over 12 years, aging out of the system at 18 with a high school diploma and the kind of survival instincts that made her good at staying quiet and bad at trusting people. The only person who'd ever really wanted her had been Grandma Iris, her mother's mother. A woman Marlo had met exactly 4 times in her childhood before the state decided that a 70-year-old with a fixed income wasn't a suitable guardian for a traumatized 6-year-old. Iris had written letters. Marlo remembered getting 2 of them during her first year in foster care, before the addresses started changing faster than the mail could follow. After that, nothing. She'd assumed her grandmother had given up, moved on, forgotten about the little girl who'd been swallowed by the system. Then, 14 months ago, while Marlo was serving her 2nd year at Riverside, a chaplain had delivered news that arrived like a punch to the sternum. Iris Reed had died of a stroke in a county hospital in Washington state, alone, with no family present. By the time the notification reached Marlo through the prison's glacial bureaucracy, her grandmother had already been cremated. No funeral, no chance to say goodbye, no chance to explain that she'd been thinking about Iris every single day for 17 years. The grief had been complicated by anger. Why hadn't Iris tried harder to find her? Why hadn't she fought the system, demanded visitation rights, refused to let Marlo disappear into the machinery of state care? It was easier to be angry than to sit with the hollow ache of being the kind of person nobody fought for. Portland's homeless shelter smelled like industrial disinfectant and desperation. Marlo checked in that first night, signed the roster with a name that felt foreign after 3 years of being called by her inmate number, and claimed a cot in a room with 43 other women. The ceiling was water-stained. Someone 3 cots over was crying softly into her pillow. Someone else was arguing with the voices only she could hear. Marlo stared at the cracks in the plaster and tried to figure out what came next. She'd applied for 17 jobs in the 2 weeks before her release, using the prison's computer lab during her allocated hour of internet access. Dishwasher, janitor, warehouse stocker, gas station attendant. Every single application had a box she had to check. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? She checked it honestly, because lying would only get her fired when the background check came back. 17 applications. 0 responses.
The next morning, she walked to Martha's Diner on Powell Street and asked if they needed help washing dishes. The manager looked her up and down, taking in the thrift store clothes and the desperate edge in her voice, and offered her $8 an hour under the table. Cash only. No questions asked.
Marlo started that afternoon, elbows deep in scalding water and grease that wouldn't come off no matter how hard she scrubbed. On her 4th day of freedom, during her lunch break, she walked to the public library and logged on to one of the public computers. She had no plan beyond searching for something, anything that might offer a path forward. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure what to even type into the search bar. Cheap housing, Oregon. Rooms for rent, Portland. Jobs, no background check. Nothing she found offered hope. Studio apartments required first and last month's rent plus a deposit. Rooms for rent wanted references and proof of employment. Jobs that didn't care about criminal records paid $4 an hour and required you to work in conditions that would make prison look comfortable. She was about to log off when a different thought occurred to her. She typed, "Cheap land for sale." The search results filled the screen with listings that might as well have been descriptions of mansions on the moon. 20 acres in Central Oregon for $85,000. 40 acres in Eastern Washington for $120,000. She started to close the browser, but then she saw a listing that made her scroll back up. Online auction. 47 acres, Willow Creek, Washington. Starting bid, $100. Her cursor hovered over the link. This had to be a mistake. Land didn't sell for $100. But when she clicked through, she found a description that explained everything with brutal honesty. Property sold as is. Significant structural damage to all buildings. No utilities currently connected. Abandoned for 5 years following owner's death in 2010. Buyer responsible for all back taxes and fees. Owner, William Cooper, deceased. Heirs have authorized sale at any price. The photos showed exactly what the description promised. A farmhouse that looked like it was held together by cobwebs and wishful thinking. Half the porch rotted through, windows either broken or missing entirely. A barn leaning at an angle that suggested it was minutes away from collapse. Fields so overgrown they looked more like young forest than farmland. And scattered throughout the property, rusted equipment that had been slowly dissolving into the earth for half a decade. It was perfect. It was completely insane. It was the only thing she'd seen in 4 days that felt even remotely possible. The auction ended in 3 days. Marlo checked the current bid. Still $100. Nobody wanted this place. It was too far from anything, too broken, too much work. But she could afford $100, technically, if she didn't eat for a week and walked everywhere and found a way to make the payment plan work. She read the fine print. Winning bidder must pay $20 deposit within 24 hours, remaining $80 within 30 days. Back taxes of $380 must be paid within 90 days. Marlo did the math in her head. She'd need to come up with $460 total within 3 months. Washing dishes at $8 an hour, working 6-hour shifts 6 days a week. That would take her nearly 3 months just to break even. But if she could pick up additional work, if she could survive on almost nothing, if she could push herself harder than she'd ever been pushed. She bookmarked the listing and logged off. For the next 3 days, she watched that auction obsessively, checking it every time she had access to a computer. The bid stayed at $100. On the final day, with 10 minutes remaining, her heart was hammering so hard she thought the librarian at the front desk could hear it. Nobody was going to outbid her. This broken, abandoned, impossible farm was going to be hers if she just clicked the button. Her finger trembled over the mouse. If she did this, she'd be all in. No safety net. No backup plan. She'd be betting her entire future on a pile of rotting wood in a town she'd never visited, trying to build something from nothing with skills she didn't have. But what was the alternative? Stay in Portland, washing dishes for cash, sleeping in a shelter, watching the days blur into weeks, blur into years, until she became one of the permanent fixtures of this city's invisible population. She clicked Confirm Bid, entered her debit card information. $20, leaving her with $27. The page refreshed. Congratulations, you are the winning bidder. Marlo stared at the screen until it went dark. Then she walked back to the shelter, climbed onto her cot, and lay there wondering if she just made the smartest decision of her life or the stupidest. The next 2 weeks were a blur of motion that left no time for second-guessing.
She worked every shift Martha's would give her, then picked up evening work, unloading trucks at a warehouse near the docks. The warehouse job paid $12 an hour cash, but the shifts didn't end until 2 in the morning and left her so exhausted she could barely remember the walk back to the shelter. She survived on day-old bread from the diner and apples she stole from grocery store displays when she thought nobody was watching. Other residents at the shelter thought she'd lost her mind. "You're buying a farm? You don't know nothing about farming." She didn't argue with them. They were right. But she also didn't have any better options, and at least this particular brand of insanity was hers. On day 16, she had $490 in her pocket. She went to the county office in Willow Creek, a 6-hour bus ride north, and paid the back taxes in cash. The clerk looked at her with an expression that landed somewhere between pity and confusion.
"You know that property's been abandoned for 5 years, right? The old man who owned it died, and his kids wanted nothing to do with it." Marlo knew. That's why she could afford it. The clerk processed the paperwork and handed her a deed. Marlo Reed, legal owner of 47 acres in Willow Creek, Washington, population 587. She folded the document carefully and tucked it into her jacket pocket next to the $12 she had left in the world. She couldn't afford a bus ticket back to Portland. Instead, she stood at the on-ramp to Highway 101 with her thumb out, waiting for someone to take pity on her. The first truck that stopped was driven by a man in his 60s who took one look at her worn-out face and offered her a sandwich along with the ride. "Where are you headed?" "Willow Creek. I just bought a farm." He didn't ask follow-up questions, which Marlo appreciated. They drove in comfortable silence while she ate the sandwich and watched the landscape change from city sprawl to small towns to stretches of highway bordered by forests so thick it looked like it had never seen a chainsaw. The truck had dropped her off at the only gas station in Willow Creek. The attendant, a woman in her 40s with suspicious eyes, gave Marlo directions to the old Cooper place. 5 miles west on Creek Road. Can't miss it. Looks like it's been through a war." Marlo started walking. The sun was already dipping toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she weren't so terrified. What if the place was even worse in person than in the photos? What if she'd just bet everything on a fantasy that would crumble the moment she tried to touch it? But turning back wasn't an option. It never had been. So she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, until she rounded a bend in the road and saw it. The photos hadn't lied, but they'd been kind. The farmhouse looked like it had given up on the concept of structural integrity and was staying upright purely out of spite. The porch sagged in the middle. The windows on the second floor were just empty rectangles where glass used to be. From somewhere in the attic came sounds that suggested a family of raccoons had established permanent residency. The barn was worse. It leaned so far to the left that Marlo couldn't understand why gravity hadn't finished the job. The red paint had faded to a color that barely qualified as pink. Half the roof was missing. The fields were a disaster.
What should have been cultivated land was now a jungle of weeds taller than Marlowe, blackberry brambles that had formed impenetrable walls, and volunteer trees that had taken root and were well on their way to reclaiming the entire property for the forest. She dropped her duffel bag on what remained of the front porch and sat down hard.
For the first time since walking out of Riverside, she felt tears burning in her eyes. What was she doing? Who did she think she was? She wasn't a farmer. She wasn't a carpenter. She was just a kid who'd gotten screwed by life and was too stubborn to admit when she was beaten. Grandma Iris would have known what to do. She would have looked at this mess and seen possibility instead of disaster. She would have rolled up her sleeves and gotten to work, and she would have known exactly where to start. But Iris was gone, and Marlowe was alone, and the sun was setting fast. She allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of despair. Then she wiped her eyes, stood up, and made a decision. Tonight, she'd find somewhere to sleep that didn't involve raccoons. Tomorrow, she'd figure out the rest. The barn was marginally more intact on the inside than its exterior suggested. One of the stalls still had 4 walls and most of a roof. Marlowe cleared out the debris, spread out her sleeping bag, and used her duffel as a pillow. The mice in the walls kept her company with their scratching and squeaking. The wind whistled through gaps in the boards. It was the most depressing bedroom she'd ever had, and she'd slept in some truly depressing places. But it was hers. Nobody could evict her. Nobody could tell her she'd aged out or broken the rules or wasn't welcome anymore. This broken, impossible, ridiculous farm belonged to her, and that meant something even if she didn't quite know what yet. She fell asleep thinking about Iris, wondering if her grandmother would be proud or horrified, hoping it was the former, fearing it was the latter. The next morning arrived with weak sunlight filtering through the barn walls. Marlowe woke stiff and cold, her breath visible in the October air. She had no coffee, no breakfast, nothing but a determination to at least understand what she'd gotten herself into. She spent the entire day walking the property, taking inventory of the disaster. The well in the front yard might still work, but she'd need to test it. The fencing had collapsed in so many places it might as well not exist. The equipment scattered around the property was so rusted she couldn't even identify what half of it had been used for. And then there was the tractor. It was parked behind the barn, almost completely hidden by vines and blackberry brambles that had grown through the wheel wells and wrapped around the engine housing. A John Deere, probably from the 1960s based on the styling, with green paint that had faded to something closer to gray. The tires were flat and cracked. The exhaust pipe had rusted through. But somehow, despite 5 years of abandonment, it still possessed a kind of dignity, like it was waiting for someone to remember it existed. Marlowe decided to clear the vegetation away from it, partly because she needed to do something productive, and partly because she was curious whether there was any chance it could ever run again. She found a rusty machete in the barn and spent the afternoon hacking away blackberry vines, pulling out saplings, sweeping away 5 years of accumulated leaves and debris. By sunset, she'd cleared enough to really see what she was working with. The tractor was in rough shape, but it was intact. No major pieces missing, no obvious holes in the engine block. She climbed up into the driver's seat, her boots crunching on rust flakes, and tried to imagine what it must have been like to work this land when everything was functional and alive. That's when she noticed the seat was slightly askew, like someone had tried to adjust it and hadn't quite pushed it back into place. She grabbed the edge and tried to straighten it, but it wouldn't budge. Rusted in place after all these years. She pulled harder, jiggling it back and forth, and suddenly something gave way with a metallic squeal. The seat lifted up. Not broke, lifted, like it was hinged. Marlowe stared at the hidden compartment beneath.
She'd never known tractor seats could do this. Inside the compartment, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth but was now mostly disintegrated fabric, was a metal box about the size of a large shoebox. Her hands were shaking as she lifted it out. The box was heavy, something substantial inside. The tin had rusted around the edges but was still intact. There was no lock, just a simple latch that had corroded shut. She carried it carefully into the barn, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears.
What were the actual odds? What were the chances that she'd buy a farm nobody wanted for $100 and find something hidden in a tractor that had been sitting here for 5 years? She used a screwdriver from her duffel to work the latch free, prying gently so she wouldn't damage whatever was inside. When it finally popped open, she had to sit down on a hay bale. Inside the box were bundles of cash. Old bills, 10s and 20s and 50s, wrapped in rubber bands that fell apart at her touch. Beneath the money were papers, documents with official-looking seals, photographs of people she didn't recognize. And beneath all of that was a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age but still readable. Marlowe counted the money 3 times because she couldn't believe what she was seeing. $8,400. To someone who had $12 to her name, it might as well have been $8 million. This was materials to fix the house, tools to work the land, food to eat while she figured out how to make this place productive. This was hope in physical, tangible form. But it wasn't hers. She opened the journal with trembling hands. The first entry was dated April 15, 1998, written in shaky handwriting that suggested the author's hands hadn't been entirely steady. My name is William Cooper. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead. I hope whoever finds this has better luck than I did. Marlowe read through the night, learning the story of the man who'd owned this farm before her. William Cooper had been a farmer his entire life, had inherited this land from his father, who'd inherited it from his father before that. He'd raised 4 children here with his wife Dorothy, had worked this soil for 53 years, had poured everything he had into making this place productive and beautiful. But in his later years, everything had fallen apart. Dorothy developed Alzheimer's and needed expensive care that insurance barely covered. Medical bills had piled up faster than he could pay them. The farm stopped being profitable as corporate agriculture moved in and small operations couldn't compete. His children had all moved away to build lives in cities, wanting nothing to do with the hard life of farming. He'd sold equipment, then livestock, then parcels of land, watching his legacy get dismantled piece by piece just to keep Dorothy in a facility where she'd be safe and cared for. The money in the box was everything he had left. He'd hidden it because he didn't trust banks after watching his parents lose their savings in the savings and loan crisis of the 80s. It was meant to be emergency money, something to keep the farm going, something to pass on to his children. But he'd gotten sick. Cancer that moved fast. And he died before he could tell anyone the money existed. His children had sold the property without ever knowing their inheritance was hidden in a tractor seat behind the barn. The journal entries told the story with heartbreaking clarity. William had loved his children desperately, but he'd never been good at showing it. He'd pushed them to stay on the farm when they wanted to leave. He'd prioritized the land over their dreams. And by the time he'd realized his mistake, they were scattered across the country and barely speaking to him. One entry, dated April 3, 1997, made Marlowe's chest tighten. David called today. He got the promotion at his company in California. I'm so proud of him, even though I never told him that enough. I was always pushing him to take over the farm, never asked what he wanted. I see that now. He's building something good out there, something that makes him happy. That should have been enough for me. Why couldn't I just tell him I was proud? Another entry,
from June 12, 1999. Cordelia hasn't visited in 3 years. Evangeline sends Christmas cards, but that's it. Silas is somewhere in Texas. We don't talk much.
Maybe that's my fault. Maybe I should have let them choose their own paths instead of trying to force them to love this place the way I did. If something happens to me, I hope they know I loved them. I hope they forgive me. The last entry was dated June 10th, 2010, 3 days before the death certificate Marlowe had seen in the county records. I'm dying. The doctors don't say it directly, but I can see it in their eyes. I need to tell the kids about this money, but they don't visit anymore. They're busy with their own lives. I understand. I wasn't always the best father. I was married to this land more than I was present for them. If something happens to me, I hope someone finds this money and uses it for something good. Don't let it sit here and rot like everything else. And if you can find my children, tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I loved them more than anything, even this farm. I just didn't know how to show it. Marlowe closed the journal and sat in the darkness of the barn, thinking about William Cooper and his children, about legacy and regret, about money and what it means to different people. $8,400 could change her life right now. It could mean the difference between this farm becoming something real or her failing and ending up back in a shelter, back in the cycle of poverty and desperation she'd just barely escaped. But it belonged to 4 people who'd lost their father, who'd sold this property for probably next to nothing because they didn't want it, didn't want the memories or the pain or the reminder of a man who'd loved land more than he'd shown he loved them. They had no idea their dad had left them something after all. She spent 4 days wrestling with the decision. 4 days of fixing what she could around the property with the $12 she had left, buying a few basic tools from the hardware store in town and eating as little as possible to stretch her money. 4 days of reading through William's journal again and again, learning about his life and his struggles and his deep, inarticulate love for the children who'd gotten away from him. She thought about her own grandmother, about Iris, who'd raised her to be honest, to do the right thing even when it was hard, about the person Marlowe wanted to be versus the person that 3 years in prison might have turned her into. On the morning of the 5th day, she made her decision. She would try to find William Cooper's children and return the money. It was the right thing to do, even if it meant losing her only chance at making this farm work. Even if it meant she'd probably fail and lose everything. Because if she kept money that wasn't hers, if she built something on that foundation, she'd never be able to look at herself without seeing exactly what those people who'd sent her to Riverside had accused her of being. Better to fail honestly than to succeed as a thief. The problem was figuring out how to find them. The journal had first names and general locations, but no phone numbers, no addresses, nothing concrete. Cordelia Cooper in Chicago could be any of 200 different people. Same with Donovan in California, Evangeline in New York, Silas in Texas. Marlowe went to the Willow Creek Public Library, a small building on Main Street that smelled like old paper and wood polish. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and silver hair, looked up from her desk as Marlowe approached. "Can I help you find something?" Marlowe hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I bought the old Cooper farm, William Cooper's place. I found some personal items that belong to him, and I'd like to return them to his family. But I don't know how to reach them." The librarian's expression softened. "Oh, I knew William. Lovely man. What happened to him and Dorothy was a tragedy. You know, his daughter Cordelia used to work at the bank here in town before she moved to Chicago." She paused, thinking.
Doris over at the county records office might have forwarding addresses from when the property was sold. They would have had to notify all the heirs. It took another week of persistence, phone calls, and navigating bureaucracy that seemed designed to make simple things impossible. But finally, Marlowe got a phone number for Cordelia Cooper in Chicago. She stood outside the library with the slip of paper in her hand, staring at the numbers like they might rearrange themselves into something less terrifying. She must have picked up the phone 20 times before she actually dialed. Her palms were sweating. Her heart was racing. She had no idea what to say, how to explain who she was or why she was calling or what she'd found. The phone rang 4 times. Then a woman's voice, professional and brisk, the voice of someone who didn't have time for unexpected calls from strangers. Cordelia Cooper. Marlowe's mouth went dry. Miss Cooper, my name is Marlowe Reed. I bought your father's farm, the one in Willow Creek. I found some things that belonged to him, and I think you and your siblings should have them. Silence on the other end of the line, long enough that Marlowe thought she might have hung up. Then Cordelia's voice changed, became softer, younger somehow. You're at the farm? Dad's farm? Yes, ma'am. I bought it a few weeks ago. And I found there's a metal box with money, $8,400, and a journal. He wrote about all of you, about how much he loved you. Another long silence.
Marlowe could hear breathing on the other end, could feel the weight of memories and complicated feelings traveling across the phone line. He left us money? After everything? After all the medical bills and the debt, he managed to save money? Cordelia's voice broke on the last word. Marlowe heard her crying, soft sobs she was trying to muffle. Yes, ma'am. And there's more. The journal. He wrote about being proud of you. All of you. About regretting that he didn't say it enough. The silence that followed was so long Marlowe thought the connection had dropped. Then Cordelia spoke again, her voice thick with tears. Can you give me the numbers for my siblings? I need to call them. We need to come see this. All of us. Over the next 3 days, Marlowe called each of William's children. Donovan in California was immediately suspicious, his voice hard and skeptical. How do I know you're not scamming us? How do I know this journal isn't fake? Marlowe didn't have good answers. She could only tell him to come see for himself, to read his father's words and decide whether they were real. Evangeline in New York was cold and detached at first. I haven't thought about my father or that farm in 8 years. I don't want his money. But when Marlowe read her an entry from the journal, one where William wrote about wishing he'd let her pursue her dreams instead of pressuring her to stay, something in Evangeline's voice shifted. I'll come. For Cordelia's sake. Not for him. Silas in Texas was the only one who cried on the phone. Marlowe read him the entry about William being proud of him for building a good life in Texas, even though he'd never said the words out loud. Silas's voice cracked. I never knew. I spent 13 years thinking he was disappointed in me. I'll be there. I need to see this. 2 weeks later, 3 rental cars pulled up the gravel driveway. Marlowe watched from inside the barn, her stomach in knots. She'd cleaned up as much as she could, clearing a path to the house, cutting back some of the worst vegetation, making the place at least marginally less shameful. But it still looked like a disaster zone, and she was suddenly aware of how she must look too. Unwashed hair, clothes she'd been wearing for days, hands covered in blisters and dirt. Cordelia got out of the first car, tall and professional in a business suit that seemed wildly out of place in this rural setting. Her husband stayed in the car. Silas emerged from the second vehicle, wearing flannel and jeans, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his face already showing the emotional weight of being back here. Evangeline came last, designer clothes and sunglasses, her partner Mark beside her, both of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Donovan hadn't come. Marlowe felt a pang of disappointment, but couldn't blame him. If their situations were reversed, she probably wouldn't trust a stranger calling about hidden money either. The three siblings stood in the driveway for a long moment, just looking at the place. Cordelia's hand went to her mouth. Silas turned away, wiping his eyes. Even Evangeline's carefully maintained composure seemed to crack at the edges. Marlowe stepped out of the barn before she lost her nerve. The journal and the metal box were tucked under her arm. All three of them turned to look at her, and she saw them taking in her appearance, her age, the obvious signs that she was barely surviving out here. "You must be Marlowe." Cordelia's voice was gentle, like she was talking to something fragile that might break. "Thank you for calling us. Thank you for this." Marlowe held out the metal box. "Before we talk about the money, I think you should read this." She handed the journal to Cordelia, who opened it with hands that trembled slightly. Marlowe watched as she found the first entry, saw her eyes scan the page, saw the moment the words hit her. Cordelia pressed her lips together, fighting for composure, and then lost the battle. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she passed the journal to Silas. Silas read silently for a moment, then his voice cracked as he read aloud the entry about William being proud of him. By the time he finished, all three of them were crying. Even Evangeline, who'd been so determined to stay detached, had tears streaming down her face. They spent hours there, reading the journal, passing it back and forth, sharing memories Marlowe had no part in. She gave them space, working on clearing more brush from around the property, but eventually Cordelia called her over. The metal box was open on the tailgate of Silas's rental truck. The money was counted and separated into 4 neat piles. Cordelia picked up one of them and held it out to Marlowe. "This is yours." Marlowe started to protest, but Cordelia cut her off. "You could have kept all of this. You bought this property legally. Anything you found on it was legally yours. You didn't have to track us down. You didn't have to give us our father's journal, which honestly means more than the money." Her voice was steady now, the tears dried, but the emotion still there. "Dad would have respected what you did. Hell, Dad would have liked you." Silas spoke up, his voice quiet. "You planning to farm this place?" Marlowe shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm going to try. I don't know anything about farming, but I'm going to try. Dad loved this land." Silas looked around at the overgrown fields, the leaning barn, the house that was barely standing. It killed him in the end, watching it fall apart. But he loved it. Someone should love it again. Evangeline surprised everyone by speaking next. "You're going to need help. That house isn't going to fix itself, and winter comes early up here." Then Cordelia's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, and her expression shifted. "It's Donovan." She answered, putting him on speaker. The three siblings stood in a circle, and Marlowe felt like an intruder on a family moment. Donovan's voice came through, tight and controlled. "Cordelia, I did some research on your Marlowe Reed. Want to know what I found?" Marlowe's stomach dropped. She knew what was coming. Marlowe Reed, 23 years old, Riverside Women's Correctional Facility, Oregon. Released 6 weeks ago. Served 3 years for theft and breaking and entering. Convicted felon. The silence that followed was crushing. All three siblings turned to look at Marlowe. She saw the questions forming, the doubt creeping in, the trust she'd worked so hard to build starting to crumble. She didn't lie.
Yes, I was convicted. No, I didn't do it. My friend framed me to protect her little sister.
I took the fall because I was stupid and young and thought loyalty mattered more than truth. Donovan's voice came through the phone, sharp with skepticism. That's what they all say. And now a convicted thief wants us to believe she's being honest about finding money. Marlo felt her face burning. Judge me by this. I found $8,400. I was broke and desperate and living in a barn, and I tracked down your sister to give it back. That's who I am. If that's not enough proof, then nothing I say will convince you. Donovan was quiet for a moment. Then, if you're still there in 6 months and haven't asked them for more money, maybe I'll believe you. Until then, count me out. The line went dead. The three siblings stood awkwardly, not quite meeting Marlo's eyes. She felt the weight of judgment settling over her like a blanket. This was always going to be her life, wasn't it? Forever marked by something she didn't do. Forever having to prove herself to people who'd already decided what she was. Then Silas spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. I believe you. Everyone turned to look at him. He was staring at Marlo with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. I believe you because you had every reason to keep that money and no reason to call us. I believe you because you're living in a barn trying to make something out of nothing, and you still chose to do the right thing. His voice gained strength. I want to help. Let me go back to Texas, quit my job properly, pack my things. I'll be back in a week and we'll work this land together. Marlo stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. You'd give up your job? Your life in Texas? For what? Managing a sporting goods store I hate? Silas shook his head. I've been running from this place for 13 years. From the memories of fighting with Dad. From the guilt of not being here when he died. From the weight of knowing I disappointed him. But reading that journal, knowing he was proud of me, maybe it's time to stop running. He looked around at the farm, at the disaster that would take years to repair. Dad wanted someone to love this land again. And you're trying to do that, even though you don't know how, even though it might destroy you. That's exactly the kind of stubborn determination Dad would have respected. He turned back to Marlo. Partners. We split whatever profit we make. If there is any profit, which honestly seems unlikely. But we try. Marlo's throat was too tight to speak. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Silas held out his hand and she shook it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. This was real. This was actually happening. She wasn't alone anymore. Cordelia wiped her eyes. I can't take time off work, but I'll send money. Monthly. Consider it investing in Dad's legacy. Evangeline was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. I'll think about it. Which was probably the best Marlo could hope for. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that almost made the ruined farm look beautiful, Marlo stood beside Silas and watched Cordelia and Evangeline drive away. She'd walked onto this property 3 weeks ago with $12 and no hope. Now she had a partner, the beginning of a family she'd never expected, and a chance at building something real. It terrified her. It might destroy her. But for the first time since walking out of Riverside, she felt something that might have been hope taking root in the wasteland of her chest. Easy wrong or hard right. She'd chosen hard right, and whatever came next, at least she'd face it as the person she wanted to be, rather than the person circumstances had tried to make her. The barn looked marginally less depressing now that she wouldn't be sleeping there alone. Silas returned from Texas 1 week later, having driven straight through with only rest-stop naps to break the journey. The U-Haul truck he'd rented was packed with everything he owned,
which turned out to be less than Marlowe expected. Clothes, mostly. A laptop, some books, a toolbox his father had given him when he turned 16 that he'd never actually used. The rest of his life in Texas had apparently been furniture that belonged to his landlord and a job he'd walked away from with 2 weeks' notice. November had arrived with the kind of cold that made sleeping in the barn feel like slow-motion hypothermia. Marlowe had spent the week since meeting the Cooper siblings making 2 rooms in the farmhouse barely habitable, patching holes in the walls with scavenged plywood and duct tape, covering broken windows with plastic sheeting that rattled in the wind.
It wasn't warm, exactly. But it was warmer than the barn, warmer than dying. This is more than I've had in years.
Silas stood in what would be his bedroom, looking at the bare walls and the sleeping bag Marlowe had laid out on the floor.
Feels like home already.
Marlowe didn't know how to respond to that. She'd never had anyone call a place she occupied home before. The word felt too big, too permanent, like if she acknowledged it, the universe would find a way to take it from her. They spent the first week figuring out how to exist in the same space without driving each other insane. Silas was methodical in ways that made Marlowe want to scream. He labeled everything, made lists, insisted on eating breakfast at the same time every morning, even though there was no schedule to keep. Marlowe operated on chaos and instinct, doing whatever task felt most urgent in the moment, which meant she'd start fixing a window and end up clearing brush because she got distracted halfway through.
But they both wanted the same thing badly enough that the differences didn't matter. The farm became a project bigger than either of them, something that required both her stubborn determination and his organized planning to have any chance of success. Neither of them knew the first thing about farming. The books William had left behind became their Bible. Crop rotation guides for the Pacific Northwest, soil management basics, seasonal planting calendars that were 2 decades out of date but still more useful than their complete lack of knowledge. They read by flashlight after the sun went down, since the farmhouse had no electricity, taking notes in margins and comparing opinions on what seemed most important to tackle first. The neighbor to the east turned out to be their unexpected salvation. Amos Morrison was 73 years old, built like someone who'd spent 6 decades wrestling with soil and weather and machinery that broke at the worst possible times. His farm bordered theirs along a fence line that had collapsed years ago, and he'd watched Marlowe and Silas stumbling through basic tasks with what looked like equal parts amusement and pity. He showed up one morning in early November driving a tractor that actually ran, pulling up to where they were trying to clear a section of field with hand tools like idiots from another century. "You going to kill yourselves doing it that way?" His voice was gravel and cigarettes. "I've got equipment you can borrow, and if you're serious about bringing this place back, I'll teach you how to use it." Marlowe looked at Silas, both of them filthy and exhausted, and saw her own desperate hope reflected in his face. "Why would you help us?" Amos shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the direct question. "Your granddaddy and I farmed side by side for 30 years. He gestured toward Silas. "Watched this place die while William tried to hold it together with spit and prayer. Broke my heart seeing it abandoned. About time someone gave it another chance." He taught them to plow straight lines, which was harder than it looked. Explained soil composition and drainage and the 100 small factors that determined whether crops would thrive or wither. Showed them how to identify which equipment was salvageable and which was too far gone to bother with. Never asked for payment, just accepted coffee and conversation, and seemed satisfied that someone was trying to honor what William had built. The other unexpected ally came in the form of Lydia Brennan, who taught 4th grade at Willow Creek Elementary and showed up one Saturday in November with work gloves and a determination that matched Marlowe's own. She'd heard about the farm through small-town gossip, the kind that traveled faster than wildfire in a place where everyone knew everyone's business. "I grew up on a farm 2 counties over. Lydia pulled her dark hair into a ponytail, ready to work. Left for college, and thought I'd never come back to agriculture. But watching you try to do this alone makes me remember why I loved it. If you want help on weekends, I'm offering. Marlowe studied her, looking for the angle, the ulterior motive. People didn't just help for free. There was always a price, even if it wasn't stated up front. Lydia must have read the suspicion on her face. No catch. I like projects that seem impossible. Make success sweeter. Their first project together was the well. The hand pump in the front yard hadn't worked in 5 years, but Amos thought it might just need a new motor. He helped them pull the old one, a rusted piece of machinery that fell apart in their hands, and directed them to a salvage yard in the next town where they found a replacement for $75. Silas paid without hesitation, which made Marlowe's chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to gratitude. She wasn't used to people spending money on her, investing in her survival like it mattered to them too. They installed it together, all 4 of them working through a cold afternoon until their fingers were numb. When Silas finally threw the lever and water came gushing out for the first time in half a decade, clear and cold and real, he turned away quickly, but not quickly enough that Marlowe didn't see the tears. Dad would be so happy. His voice was rough. Someone's bringing this place back to life. Marlowe wanted to say something comforting, but she'd never had a father, had no reference point for that particular flavor of grief and pride mixed together. Instead, she caught water in her hands and drank it, tasting like metal and earth and possibility. 3 weeks into November, certified mail arrived at the Willow Creek post office addressed to Marlowe Reed. The postal worker, a woman named Judith, who looked at Marlowe like she was a puzzle that didn't quite fit together, handed it over with obvious curiosity. Estate notification. Probably want to read that somewhere private. Marlowe waited until she was back at the farmhouse, Silas working outside on clearing more field space before she opened it. The letterhead read, Estate of Iris Reed, Final Distribution. And for a moment she couldn't breathe. Her grandmother's estate. She'd assumed there was nothing, that the hospital bills and cremation costs had consumed whatever little Iris had possessed. The letter was from a lawyer in Willow Creek, informing her that Iris Reed had owned 40 acres of land adjacent to the Cooper farm, purchased in the year 2000 for $3,200 and paid off in full by 2008. The property was now legally Marlowe's. Property taxes had been kept current through 2014, the year of Iris's death. There was a small cabin on the site. A key was waiting at the lawyer's office. Marlowe read it 3 times, each time feeling like someone had reached into her chest and squeezed. Her grandmother had owned land, 40 acres, right next to where Marlowe had randomly, impossibly ended up buying a farm. The coincidence was too large to process, too strange to be accident. She stumbled outside, the letter shaking in her hands. Silas looked up from the fence post he was trying to repair, saw her face, and dropped his tools. What happened? She left me something. Marlowe's voice didn't sound like her own. My grandmother. She bought land, 40 acres. It's mine now. Silas took the letter, read it, then looked at Marlowe with an expression she couldn't interpret. Your grandmother bought land for you 15 years ago? I didn't know. Marlowe felt tears burning her eyes. All this time I thought she had nothing. Thought she'd forgotten about me. But she was building me a home. The lawyer's office was a single room above the hardware store, staffed by a man in his 60s who seemed unsurprised by their visit. He handed Marlowe a key on a ring with a small wooden tag that read, Iris, in faded marker. She wanted you to have a place to come back to. The lawyer's voice was gentle. Came in every year to pay the property taxes.
Always said her granddaughter would need it someday. The drive to the property took 10 minutes, following a dirt road that branched off from the main highway. 40 acres covered in similar overgrowth to the Cooper farm, but with a small cabin visible through the trees. One bedroom, wood siding that had weathered to silver, a porch that sagged slightly but was still intact. Marlowe's hands were shaking so badly she could barely get the key in the lock. When the door swung open, she saw boxes, dozens of cardboard boxes stacked against the walls, each one labeled in handwriting she recognized from the 2 letters she'd received as a child. Silas stayed on the porch, giving her space. Marlowe moved through the cabin like she was walking through a dream. The boxes contained her childhood. Drawings she'd made in 1st grade, school papers with gold stars, a stuffed rabbit she'd carried everywhere until it got left behind in one of the moves between foster homes, baby clothes, photographs of her parents that she'd thought were lost forever. And then, in the corner, a larger box, cardboard reinforced with packing tape labeled in black marker, "For Marlowe. Return to sender." She knew before she opened it what she'd find, could feel the weight of it, the significance pressing down on her like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Her fingers fumbled with the tape, finally ripping it away to reveal envelopes. Hundreds of them, all addressed to Marlowe Reed at various foster care addresses across Oregon. All stamped with red ink, address unknown, or recipient moved, return to sender. She pulled one out. The postmark read, June 1999, her 7th birthday. The envelope had been opened, read, then carefully preserved. Inside was a card with balloons on the front and a letter written in Iris's careful cursive. My dearest Marlowe, I think about you every single day. The foster system won't tell me where you are, but I'm trying so hard to find you. I bought a little piece of land last year. Someday it will be yours. Someday you'll come home to me. I love you more than words can say. Grandma Iris. Marlowe sat down hard on the cabin floor. Silas appeared in the doorway, concern etched across his face, but she couldn't speak. Could only pull out envelope after envelope, watching the dates progress through 16 years. Birthdays, Christmases, Easters, random Tuesdays when Iris had apparently felt compelled to write, even though she knew the letter would come back. She counted them, had to know. 247 letters. 16 years of trying to reach a granddaughter who kept moving, kept slipping through the system's bureaucratic fingers, never staying anywhere long enough for mail to find her. A letter from Christmas 2007, when Marlowe was 15 and angry at the world, written by a grandmother who had no idea her granddaughter was in her 7th foster home and considering running away. Sweet girl. I sent 11 letters to 4 different addresses this year. They all came back. But I won't stop. I will never stop trying to reach you. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. Even if you don't know it, I'm here, loving you, fighting for you. I bought more land this year. It's next to a beautiful farm. Someday you'll see it. All my love, Grandma. The last letter was dated June 2014, Marlowe's 22nd birthday. She was in Riverside by then, serving her 2nd year, and Iris was writing from a hospital bed. My darling Marlowe, I'm writing this from the hospital. The doctors say I don't have much time. I'm so sorry I never found you. I'm sorry you had to grow up thinking you were alone. I've written 247 letters over 16 years. Every single one came back. But I kept writing because love doesn't stop when letters don't arrive. Love doesn't stop when you can't reach someone. Love keeps trying. I bought 40 acres of land for you. It's yours now. I've kept the taxes paid. There's a small cabin. It's not much, but it's yours. You have a home waiting, even if you don't know it yet. If you ever read this, know you were wanted. You were loved. I never gave up on you. I never will. Please forgive me for not finding you sooner. I'm so proud of you, my beautiful girl. All my love forever, Grandma Iris. Marlowe's chest cracked open. She'd spent 23 years believing nobody wanted her.
17 years thinking her grandmother had moved on, forgotten, stopped caring. But Iris had been fighting the entire time, writing letters that bounced back like echoes in an empty room, buying land, paying taxes, building a future for a girl she couldn't reach. She sobbed until her throat was raw and her ribs ached. Silas sat beside her on the floor, not touching, just present, letting her fall apart without trying to fix it. When she could finally speak, her voice came out broken. 247 letters, 16 years. She never stopped. The weight of it was crushing. All those years in foster care, feeling disposable and temporary and unwanted, while her grandmother was writing letters and buying land and refusing to give up hope. The universe had kept them apart through bureaucracy and bad luck and a system that lost children in its machinery. But Iris had never stopped trying to build a bridge across that distance. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then my dad wrote in his journal that he wasn't good at saying he loved us. Wrote it down, but never said the words out loud. Your grandmother wrote the words, but they never reached you. His voice was thick. Maybe that's what we're doing here. Finishing what they started. Making sure the love they tried to give actually gets where it was supposed to go. Something in Marlowe shifted. She wasn't just saving William's farm anymore. She was honoring her grandmother's 16-year fight to give her a home. The 40 acres Iris had bought, the cabin she'd maintained, the letters she'd kept even though they'd all come back. This was legacy in its purest form. Not money or land, but the refusal to abandon someone even when reaching them seemed impossible. I'm going to make her proud. Marlowe's hands were still shaking, but her voice was steady. If it's the last thing I do, I'm going to make this work. For her. For your dad. For everyone who believed in something when there was no reason to. They loaded the boxes into Silas's truck, bringing Marlowe's childhood home to the farmhouse that was slowly becoming home in a way she'd never experienced before. That night, she read through more of the letters while Silas cooked dinner on the camp stove, learning about her grandmother through words that had taken 16 years to reach her. December brought the first serious cold, and with it, disaster in expensive shoes. A black Mercedes pulled up the driveway, out of place as a spaceship in the mud and overgrown weeds. The man who emerged wore a suit that probably cost more than everything Marlowe owned combined. Mid-40s, with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. You must be Marlowe Reed. He didn't offer his hand. I'm Robert Hendricks, Jr. My Uncle William owned this property before you bought it. Marlowe's stomach clenched. She knew that name from William's journal. The nephew who'd been trying to buy the farm for years. William had mentioned him exactly twice. Both times with language that suggested deep distrust. The farm's not for sale. Robert smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Everything's for sale at the right price. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000. That's significantly more than what you paid. Silas had emerged from the barn, sensing trouble. He positioned himself slightly behind Marlowe, a silent show of support that Robert's eyes tracked and dismissed. I said it's not for sale. The smile vanished. You don't understand what you're dealing with. My uncle made me a verbal promise before he died that this land would come to me. You buying it was a mistake that needs to be corrected. A promise. Marlowe's voice was flat. Not in writing,
just a conversation you claim happened. It happened. Robert's tone sharpened. And if you don't accept my very generous offer, I'll prove it in court. You have 60 days to reconsider.
He drove away, leaving tire tracks in the mud like threats. Marlowe and Silas spent the rest of the day researching Robert Hendricks Jr., using Lydia's laptop and the library's Wi-Fi. What they found made Marlowe's blood run cold. Robert was a real estate developer with a track record of acquiring farmland through questionable means. 6 properties in the last decade, all of them small farms that had been in families for generations. 4 of those families had been displaced, their land sold to corporations for development. Mining companies mostly. The pattern was consistent enough to be a strategy. Amos Morrison confirmed it that evening when they went to him for advice. That bastard's been trying to get this land for 8 years. Showed up at William's door every few months with a new offer, each one more insulting than the last. William told him to go to hell every single time. Why does he want it so badly? Amos's expression was grim. Lithium. There's deposits under half the farms in this valley. Mining companies will pay top dollar for the rights, and guys like Robert know how to work the system. Buy cheap, sell high. Don't care who gets hurt in the process. 2 weeks later, Marlowe was served with a lawsuit. Robert Hendricks Jr. versus Marlowe Reed, contesting the legal sale of the property on grounds that William Cooper had been mentally incompetent during his final months due to cancer treatment and pain medication. The suit claimed the estate had been improperly sold without proper verification of the deceased's wishes. Attached were affidavits from 3 people Marlowe had never heard of, all claiming William had promised the land to Robert in their presence. The court date was set for June. 6 months away, but close enough that Marlowe felt it like a countdown to execution. She couldn't afford a lawyer, could barely afford food. The idea of fighting a legal battle against someone with Robert's resources felt like preparing to fight a tank with a pocket knife. Cordelia called the day after the lawsuit arrived. I heard. Donovan's already booking a flight. He knows lawyers in Seattle who owe him favors. True to her word, Donovan showed up 3 days later looking tired and apologetic. I'm sorry I doubted you. You've proven yourself 10 times over. Let me help you fight this. Having Donovan's support felt like gaining an ally in a war Marlowe hadn't known she was fighting. But it didn't change the fundamental problem. Robert had money and connections and a willingness to lie. Marlowe had the truth and no way to prove it. Spring came anyway, indifferent to lawsuits and existential dread. March brought the first thaw, and with it, the urgent need to plant if they wanted any chance of making the farm productive. Lawsuit or no lawsuit, Marlowe and Silas couldn't afford to waste a growing season waiting for courts to decide their fate. They planted 5 acres with help from Lydia, Amos, and Donovan, who'd extended his visit indefinitely. 3 acres of potatoes, 2 acres of sweet corn. Seeds that cost money they barely had, purchased with Cordelia's investment and Marlowe's dwindling savings from her warehouse job. The work was backbreaking. Plowing fields by hand and borrowed tractor, spreading soil amendments Amos recommended, spacing seeds according to instructions in William's old books. Marlowe's hands developed new calluses on top of old ones. Her back ached constantly. But there was something deeply satisfying about watching the land transform from wasteland to rows of potential. Then a late frost hit in early April, killing 15% of their seedlings overnight. Marlowe stood in the field at dawn, looking at blackened plants that had been green and hopeful the day before, and wanted to scream. We replant. Silas's voice was steady. Dad dealt with this every year. Weather doesn't care about our plans. Easy for you to say. Marlowe heard the edge in her own voice, sharp with exhaustion and fear. You gave up a job to be here.
I gave up everything." The words hung between them, ugly and true. Silas's face went carefully blank. "You think I didn't give up anything?" His voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse. "I left my girlfriend, my apartment, my entire life, because I thought we were building something together." Marlo knew she should apologize, but the fear was too big, and the frost had killed too many plants, and the lawsuit was a constant weight she couldn't escape. They worked in brittle silence for the rest of the day. The partnership that had felt solid now fractured along fault lines neither of them had noticed forming.
That night, Marlo went to Iris's cabin and read through the letters again, looking for strength in her grandmother's refusal to give up. When she returned to the farmhouse at midnight, she found Silas still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and William's journal open in front of him. "I'm sorry." The words came out rough. "I'm terrified, and I took it out on you." Silas looked up, exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. "I'm terrified too, but we don't survive this by turning on each other." They stayed up until 3 in the morning, talking through fears and plans and the very real possibility that they might lose everything. But by the time they went to bed, the fracture had been repaired, the partnership reinforced by honesty instead of the polite fiction that either of them had this figured out. The community rallied in ways Marlo hadn't expected. When word spread about the lawsuit, residents of Willow Creek organized a fundraiser. Margot Hayes, the librarian, set up a donation jar at the front desk. Martha from the diner hosted a Saturday breakfast where all proceeds went to Marlo's legal defense fund. By the end of April, they'd raised $4,200. Amos Morrison handed her an envelope with his contribution and a piece of information that made her chest tighten. "Your grandmother used to come into town, back when she first bought that land. Would ask everyone if they knew about vacant property, good soil, close to water. Said it was for her granddaughter, that the girl was going to need a home someday." The pieces were falling into place with a pattern Marlo was only beginning to see. Iris buying land in Willow Creek wasn't random. She'd been looking for the right place, asking questions, making connections. And somehow, through coincidence or fate or something beyond understanding, Marlo had ended up buying the farm directly adjacent to the land her grandmother had chosen. May arrived with the lawsuit trial only 3 weeks away, and Marlo's legal team still scrambling for evidence. Donovan had connected her with a lawyer who was willing to work for a fraction of his normal rate, but the case was still weak. William's will had never been found. The county had approved the estate sale. Robert's affidavits claimed verbal promises that couldn't be disproven. Marlo was running out of time and options. She drove to Iris's cabin one afternoon, desperate for anything that might help, and tore through it like a woman possessed. Every box, every drawer, every corner. Looking for what, she didn't know. Some proof that her grandmother's connection to this land was deeper than simple real estate investment. The floorboards in the bedroom creaked oddly under her weight. She'd noticed it before, but never investigated. Now, driven by desperation, she pried at the edge of one board until it came loose. Beneath it was a space just large enough for a metal lockbox. Her hands were shaking as she pulled it free. The lock had rusted but gave way with minimal force. Inside were documents that made her heart stop. An original deed showing Iris had paid $8,000 for the 40 acres, not the $3,200 recorded in county records. A receipt with 2 signatures, one of them belonging to Robert Hendricks Sr., Robert Jr.'s father. The math was obvious. Robert's father had pocketed the difference, committing tax fraud to hide the extra $4,800. And beneath that, a letter dated 2009, written in William Cooper's handwriting. Dear Iris, I'm sorry my brother cheated you when he sold you that land.
You paid $8,000, but he only reported $3,200 to dodge taxes. I found his ledgers after he died last year. You told me the land was for your granddaughter Marlo. I remember. You came to my farm in 2000, crying, saying foster care took her and you needed to build her a home for when she came back.
I'm dying now. Cancer. I want you to know, if Marlo ever comes to Willow Creek, I want her to have my farm too. She's family to me, because of you. I'm leaving instructions in my will, but I'm hiding it where my greedy nephew Robert Jr. won't find it. Look inside the tractor seat. Tell Marlo. 2 people she never met fought for her. We believed in her. She has a home here. Your friend, William Cooper.
Marlo read it 3 times, tears blurring the words. Her grandmother and William had known each other, had been friends. Iris had bought land next to his farm not by accident, but by design. And William, knowing Iris's granddaughter might someday come looking for home, had left his own farm to her. At the bottom of the lockbox was William's actual will, typed and notarized, dated June 2010. The language was clear. If Marlo Reed, granddaughter of Iris Reed, ever comes to Willow Creek, she has first right to purchase my farm at a fair price. If she purchases it, Robert Hendricks Jr.
is expressly prohibited from contesting the sale. Everything clicked into place. Robert Jr. must have found William's will and hidden it, or never reported its existence to the county. He'd authorized the estate sale knowing it would be contested later, betting that whoever bought the farm wouldn't have resources to fight back. But he hadn't counted on Marlo finding proof, hadn't counted on his own father's fraud coming back decades later, hadn't counted on the fact that 2 people he'd probably never thought about had been planning for someone they'd never met. She drove back to the farmhouse, going 15 miles over the speed limit, burst through the door waving the documents. Silas looked up from the stove where he was attempting to cook dinner. "We have proof." Marlo's voice was shaking. "Grandma knew William. They were friends. He wanted me to have his farm. Robert Jr.'s father committed fraud. It's all here." They stayed up all night going through the documents, making copies, building a case. William's will was ironclad. The deed showed Robert Sr.'s tax evasion. The letter proved William and Iris's relationship and William's intentions. The lawyer called it a smoking gun. With this evidence, not only would Marlo win the case, but Robert Jr. might face criminal charges for suppressing a legal will. 1 week before trial, Robert Jr. tried one final move. Fire broke out in the barn at 2 in the morning, flames visible for miles. Marlo and Silas barely made it out of the farmhouse in time, watching from a safe distance as the structure that had sheltered her that first night burned to the ground. The sheriff ruled it faulty wiring, but everyone knew. Robert was escalating, trying to destroy evidence or intimidate them into submission. But Marlo had already made copies of everything. The fire destroyed nothing that mattered except the barn itself, and even that could be rebuilt. She sat in Iris's cabin that night, rereading the 247 letters by flashlight, drawing strength from her grandmother's 16-year refusal to give up. The last letter played on repeat in her mind. Love doesn't stop when letters don't arrive. Love keeps trying. "Okay, Grandma." Marlo's voice was steady in the darkness. "I'm not giving up. I'll keep fighting." The next morning, Donovan arrived with someone unexpected. FBI agent Patricia Vance, who'd been investigating Robert Hendricks Jr. for years on fraud and extortion charges related to his property acquisitions. The barn fire had finally given them cause to move, but they needed more evidence. They needed Robert to confess on tape. "Wear a wire." Agent Vance's voice was professional, calm. "He'll try to threaten you one more time before trial. When he does, we'll have everything we need." Trial day arrived with spring rain that felt appropriate for the occasion.
Marlowe stood outside the courthouse, the wire taped to her ribs feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. Robert appeared right on schedule, pulling her aside with a grip on her elbow that was just slightly too tight. Last chance. His voice was low, meant only for her. 80,000. Final offer. Take it, or I'll make sure you end up back in prison where you belong. Marlowe's heart was pounding, but her voice came out steady. Why do you want this land so badly? Robert's smile was cold. Mining rights. Lithium deposits worth $2 million under that soil. Your grandmother was stupid to overpay for worthless dirt. My Uncle William was senile at the end, cancer eating his brain. His will doesn't mean anything. The wire caught every word. Marlowe kept him talking, asking questions that made him boast about connections and payoffs. He admitted to bribing Judge Morrison, the judge originally assigned to the case, admitted the affidavits were lies purchased from people who owed him money.
And then, perhaps sensing he'd said too much, his expression shifted. The barn fire was a warning. Next time, it's the house. With you inside. Don't test me. FBI agents moved in before he'd finished the threat. Robert's face went from confidence to confusion to fear in the span of seconds. They arrested him in the courthouse parking lot, reading rights while rain soaked everyone to the skin. Judge Morrison was picked up an hour later. The county assessor who'd helped falsify records went down by afternoon. Inside the courthouse, a different judge reviewed the evidence. William's will, the deed showing fraud, the letter proving William and Iris's friendship and intentions, the recording of Robert's confession. It took less than an hour to rule in Marlowe's favor. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. Marlowe's purchase of the farm was declared legal and binding. Robert Hendricks Jr. was permanently barred from any claim to the property. Outside, Marlowe stood in the rain and couldn't stop shaking. Silas wrapped an arm around her shoulders, solid and steady, and she let herself lean into him. We did it. His voice was thick with emotion. Grandma, Dad, we fought for what you left us. We didn't give up. The tears came then, relief and exhaustion and the weight of 6 months of fear finally released. She'd walked out of Riverside with $47 and nothing resembling hope. She'd bought a farm for $100 because she had nowhere else to go. She'd found money and returned it and made a choice that could have destroyed her. And somehow, impossibly, she'd survived. Not just survived. Won. The farm was hers. All 47 acres of William's land, plus the 40 acres Iris had bought. 87 acres total. A legacy built by 2 people who'd loved her before they ever knew her name. She thought about the 247 letters, about Iris writing year after year to a granddaughter she couldn't reach. About William hiding a will in a tractor seat so the right person would find it. About the impossible chain of coincidences that had led her to this exact place at this exact time. Maybe it wasn't coincidence at all. Maybe it was 2 people refusing to let bureaucracy and distance and death keep them from giving a lost girl a home. Maybe love really did keep trying, even when it seemed impossible, until finally the trying paid off and the lost got found, and the home that had been waiting finally got claimed. Marlowe lifted her face to the rain and let it wash away the fear. August arrived with heat that turned the fields into something close to what Marlowe had imagined farming might look like back when this was just a desperate gamble and $100 bid. The sweet corn stood taller than her head in some places, stalks thick with ears that felt heavy and real when she tested them. The potatoes had survived the blight that took 40% of the crop, leaving them with diminished yield but enough to harvest and sell. The work of bringing in that first harvest made everything before it seem like warm-up exercises. Marlowe and Silas started at dawn and worked until sunset couldn't justify staying in the fields anymore, hands raw from stripping corn husks, backs screaming from bending over potato plants and digging through soil. Lydia came every day she wasn't teaching. Amos brought his grandsons to help, and even Donovan stayed an extra week to see them through. They pulled 4,200 ears of corn from 2 acres, which Amos informed them was about 45% of what experienced farmers would have managed. The potatoes yielded 16,500 pounds from the remaining acreage after black damage. Numbers that sounded impressive until you factored in the expenses and labor and realized they'd barely scratched survival. Willow Creek Saturday Farmers Market became their testing ground. Marlowe set up a card table with a hand-painted sign that read, "Reed Cooper Farm," feeling like a fraud offering produce when she'd only been farming for 4 months. Silas arranged the corn in neat rows, 50 cents per ear or $5 for a dozen, while she tried to look like someone who belonged here. The first hour was brutal. People walked past without making eye contact, or stopped to examine the corn with skeptical expressions before moving on to vendors they recognized. Marlowe watched her first legitimate harvest sit untouched and felt the familiar weight of being unwanted settling back over her shoulders. Then, Margot Hayes appeared, her silver hair catching morning light, and picked up a dozen ears with the kind of deliberate certainty that said this wasn't about the corn. "These are from the Cooper farm. I remember when Williams' corn was the best in the county. Looks like someone's bringing that back." She paid with a 20 and told Marlowe to keep the change. Within an hour, word had spread through the market's strange economy of small-town gossip. The Reed girl who fought Robert Hendricks Jr., the one who returned Williams' money to his kids, the one trying to save the farm everyone thought was dead. By afternoon, they'd sold 2,800 ears and were scrambling to bring more from the truck. Marlowe's face hurt from smiling at strangers, from answering the same questions about how she'd learned to farm, from accepting compliments that felt unearned when Amos had done half the teaching and luck had done the rest. The potatoes moved through different channels. Restaurants in the next town bought 8,000 pounds at 40 cents per pound. Farmers markets took another 6,000 at 60 cents. The Willow Creek General Store purchased the remainder at 35 cents for their produce section. By the time September arrived and the last of the harvest was sold, Marlowe sat down with a calculator and did math that felt simultaneously triumphant and devastating. Total revenue, $8,200. Total expenses, $5,100 for seeds, fertilizer, water, equipment rental, barn reconstruction materials, and miscellaneous costs she'd stopped tracking carefully halfway through. Net profit, $3,100. Split between her and Silas, $1,550 each. She'd made $1,500 in 6 months of work that had nearly killed her multiple times. In Texas, Silas had been making twice that managing a store he hated. The numbers were impossible to celebrate and impossible to call failure at the same time. We made $1,500 each for 6 months of destroying our backs. Silas stared at the calculator like it might change its mind. I made more selling camping equipment to people who'd never see a tent. But you've never been this happy. Marlowe kept her voice neutral, giving him space to admit or deny it. His expression shifted, something like wonder breaking through the exhaustion. No, I haven't. We grew food. People ate what we made with our own hands. Money isn't everything. The phrase landed in Marlowe's chest and stayed there. Money wasn't everything, but it was something, and they'd need more of it if they wanted to expand next season. The farm was surviving, barely, on the edge of viability. One bad season, one unexpected expense, one injury that prevented work would tip them over into failure. But they'd done it.
First harvest complete. The farm had produced actual food that fed actual people. William's land wasn't abandoned anymore. Iris's investment in dirt and hope had yielded something measurable. It wasn't wealth or security, but it was movement in the right direction.
October brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Evangeline Cooper, who arrived without warning, driving a rental car that looked deeply uncomfortable on the dirt road to the farm. She'd stayed in New York after their first meeting, sending occasional texts to Silas, but maintaining careful distance from anything that might require emotional investment. She got out of the car, wearing clothes that would have been appropriate for a Manhattan gallery opening and completely absurd for a farm that still had more mud than anything else. Her expression was guarded, defensive, like she expected judgment and was preparing to return it with interest. "I've been thinking about Dad's journal." Her voice was clipped, professional. "The part where he wrote about me." Marlowe waited, giving her space to get wherever she was going with this. "He wrote that he told me farms were more important than fancy careers, that I hung up on him." Evangeline's composure cracked slightly. "I thought he hated me for leaving, for choosing marketing over staying here and working soil until I died like he did. Carried that for 12 years. But he was proud." Silas had come out of the house, his voice gentle in a way that said he understood this particular flavor of regret. "The journal said so." "I know. Now." Evangeline pulled herself together with visible effort. "But I spent 12 years running from guilt, from this place and everything it represented. Reading his words about wishing he'd told me to follow my dreams. That changed something." She paused, looking around at the farm with an expression Marlowe couldn't quite read. "I work in marketing, social media, branding, content creation. Let me help you build this farm's presence. Consider it for Dad." "They don't have money for marketing." Silas kept his tone neutral. "I'm not asking for payment." Evangeline's voice was firm. "I'm doing this because you gave us our father back, Marlowe." "Because you're trying to honor what he built. Because maybe, if I help you succeed, it balances out some of the years I spent pretending this place didn't exist." Over the following weeks, Evangeline created an Instagram account that transformed the farm from invisible to visible in ways Marlowe found simultaneously exciting and uncomfortable. She posted photos of sunrise over newly plowed fields, close-ups of vegetables with soil still clinging to their roots, quotes from William's journal paired with images of the restored farmhouse. The caption strategy was simple and devastating. Honoring a legacy, building a future, one season at a time. Within a month, they had 1,200 followers. Comments poured in from strangers who'd never set foot in Willow Creek, but felt connected to the story Evangeline was weaving. People drove from 2 hours away to visit the farm, to buy produce directly, to take pictures in front of the barn they'd seen online. It felt surreal watching their struggle become content. Their survival packaged into inspirational narratives for people scrolling through phones. But it also brought customers and revenue and attention that translated into opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. December settled over the farm with the kind of cold that made Marlowe grateful for the house repairs Donovan's crew had completed. The farmhouse had insulation now, functional windows, a wood stove that actually heated the rooms instead of just making smoke. Small luxuries that felt enormous after months of sleeping in conditions that barely qualified as shelter. Winter also brought time for projects they'd been too busy to tackle during growing season. Marlowe and Silas spent evenings in the barn, working on the John Deere tractor that had started everything. The restoration became almost meditative, each component cleaned and assessed and either repaired or replaced. They learned about engines through trial and error, YouTube videos watched on Lydia's laptop,
and advice from Amos that usually started with, "You're doing it wrong," and ended with grudging approval when they figured it out. Lydia had become more than just the weekend teacher who helped with farming. Somewhere between fixing the well in November and rebuilding the tractor in December, something had shifted. Marlo couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but suddenly she was aware of the way Lydia laughed at her terrible jokes, the way their hands would brush when passing tools, the comfortable silences that felt more intimate than conversation. It happened one evening in late December while they were working on the tractor's carburetor. Lydia had grease on her cheek, and her hair was falling out of its ponytail, and she looked at Marlo with an expression that made time feel like it had stopped. "You know I'm not just here for the farming, right?" Lydia's voice was quiet, careful.
Marlo's hands froze on the wrench she was holding. "What do you mean?"
"I mean I come here every weekend because of you. Because somewhere around the second or third time you tried to fix something without asking for help and nearly broke it worse, I realized I wanted to be around to see what you'd try next." Lydia set down the carburetor she'd been cleaning. "And then I just wanted to be around you. Period." The kiss that followed was tentative at first, both of them unsure and covered in engine grease. But it felt more right than anything Marlo had experienced in her entire chaotic life. When they finally broke apart, Lydia was smiling. "So, that happened." Her voice was steady, no regret or uncertainty in it. "That happened." Marlo found herself smiling back. "Is this okay?" "This is more than okay. This is the best decision I've made since deciding to help two complete strangers farm land they knew nothing about."
They kept it quiet at first, neither of them needing to announce anything or make it official. But by January, Lydia was spending more nights at the farmhouse than at her apartment in town. By February, they'd stopped pretending it was temporary. And by March, when Silas casually mentioned that he was glad Marlo wasn't alone anymore, they realized everyone had figured it out without anyone needing to say anything. 4 months of work, countless skinned knuckles, and more rust remover than seemed physically possible later, the tractor sat in the barn looking almost new. Green paint restored to something close to its original shade, new tires that actually held air, an engine that had been completely rebuilt with parts sourced from 3 different salvage yards. The day it started for the first time in years, the sound was loud enough to bring Lydia running from the house where she'd been grading papers. The engine roared to life with a cloud of exhaust and a mechanical scream that settled into a rough idle. Silas's face was pure joy, the kind of unfiltered happiness that made him look 10 years younger. Dad would lose his mind seeing this. His voice was rough with emotion. "We brought it back." Marlo climbed into the driver's seat one more time, this time on a machine that actually functioned instead of just existing as a monument to abandonment. She was doing a final check of the compartment where she'd found the metal box when her fingers caught on something she'd missed before. A second envelope, wedged into a gap between metal and fabric lining, stuck so firmly it had survived her initial discovery. The envelope was addressed in William's handwriting. To Marlo Reed, dated June 2009. Her hands went numb. Silas noticed her frozen posture and climbed up beside her, looking over her shoulder as she carefully extracted the envelope and broke the seal that had held for years. The letter inside was written on the same paper as William's journal entries, in the same shaky handwriting that suggested his hands had already been failing him. "Dear Marlo, if you're reading this, then Iris and I are both gone, and you found your way home. Yes, home. This land is meant to be yours. Your grandmother came to me in 2000, heartbroken. She told me about you, her granddaughter, taken by foster care, moved around so much that her letters couldn't reach you. She'd saved for years and wanted to buy land. She said, When Marlo turns 18, she'll need a home to come back to. I sold her 40 acres. My brother cheated her, charged $8,000, but only reported $3,200. I didn't know until after he died. I'm sorry for that. But Iris never gave up on you. She paid every tax bill. She kept that cabin in repair. She wrote you 247 letters, even though they all came back. That's love, Marlo. Real love. I lost my own children because I loved this land more than I showed I loved them. I don't want my farm to die with me. I want it to live through someone who understands what it means to fight for something. Iris told me you were in trouble, some legal issue. She didn't know details. She said you were innocent, but nobody believed you. She cried in my kitchen, saying I don't know where she is. I can't help her. I told Iris, if Marlo ever comes to Willow Creek, she can have my farm too. I wrote it in my will. It's hidden in this tractor so my greedy nephew Robert Jr. can't destroy it. 2 people you never met left you this land, Marlo. Your grandmother and me. We believed in you before we ever met you. We fought for you when you didn't know we existed. Don't waste it. Build something beautiful. Love this land. Let it heal you the way it healed me for 53 years. And know this. You were wanted. You were fought for. You were loved. Welcome home, Marlo. Your honorary grandfather, William Cooper. The letter ended with a postscript that made Marlo's vision blur. Tell my kids I'm sorry. Tell them I love them. And thank you for giving them back to each other. Iris would have loved you for that. She couldn't speak, could barely breathe. The weight of what William and Iris had done, the conspiracy of love between 2 people trying to build a future for someone they'd never met, was too immense to process. They'd known each other, had been friends, had planned together for a granddaughter and a farm and a convergence that must have seemed unlikely at best. But Iris had kept paying taxes and writing letters and believing. William had hidden a will and kept his promise and trusted that someday the right person would find the right tractor. And somehow, impossibly, Marlo had stumbled into the exact place they'd prepared for her. Buying a farm for $100 because she'd had nowhere else to go, not knowing she'd actually been coming home to something that had been waiting for her all along. He knew. Silas's voice was barely audible. He knew about you before you ever came here, planned for you, called you his honorary grandfather. Marlo read the letter 3 more times that night, memorizing the words, trying to internalize the magnitude of what had been given to her. Not just land or money or physical inheritance, but something deeper. Proof that she'd mattered to people before she ever did anything to earn it. Evidence that love could exist and persist and prepare futures even when the distance seemed insurmountable. January brought news that landed like vindication wrapped in bureaucracy. A letter from the Oregon District Attorney's Office. Official seal and formal language that took 3 paragraphs to say what could have been stated in 1 sentence. New evidence had emerged in the case of State versus Marlo Reed. Megan Torrance, the friend who'd set Marlo up, had confessed to the 2012 theft, providing details that corroborated Marlo's original statement. The conviction was being overturned. Marlo's criminal record was being expunged. She was officially, legally, completely innocent. She read it twice, waiting for the emotion to hit. Relief or vindication, or anger at the 3 years stolen from her. Instead, she felt mostly numb. The paper said she was innocent, but she'd already known that. The state's acknowledgement didn't erase the time served or restore what had been lost. Silas found her sitting on the porch with the letter in her hand, staring at fields that were dormant under winter frost. "You okay?" They're saying I didn't do it. After 3 years of saying I did. Marlowe's voice was flat. I thought this would feel bigger, more important. But you already proved who you were. Silas sat beside her. You proved it when you returned that money, when you built this farm, when you chose right over easy every single time. The state's opinion doesn't change what you already know. He was correct, and that realization carried its own weight. She'd spent so much energy during her time in Riverside imagining what exoneration would feel like, how it would transform everything to have official acknowledgement of her innocence. But sitting here, with land she owned and a partnership she valued and a future she was actively building, the state's letter felt like documentation of something she'd already moved past. I'm not who I was when they arrested me. The truth settled as she spoke it. That person was broken and angry and convinced she was disposable. I'm someone else now. Who are you now? Silas's question was genuine, curious rather than rhetorical. Marlowe thought about Iris writing 247 letters, William hiding a will in a tractor seat, the choice to return $8,000 when keeping it would have been so much easier. The farm slowly coming back to life under her hands, Lydia teaching her about soil composition and also about what it felt like to be wanted by someone who saw her completely and chose her anyway. Someone who keeps trying, even when it seems impossible. Her voice was steady. Someone who was fought for. And now I'm trying to deserve that by giving it forward. Spring came for the second time since Marlowe had bought the farm, and with it came expansion. 10 acres under cultivation instead of 5, potatoes and corn joined by green beans, tomatoes, and 3 varieties of squash. Seeds purchased with Cordelia's continued investment and the modest profit from year 1, planted with confidence built from surviving the first season. They hired their first employee in April, a 19-year-old named Ryan, whose family farm had been foreclosed on the previous year. He worked with the desperate energy of someone who understood what was at stake, who knew how quickly farming could go from survival to disaster. His sister Amy joined them in May, fresh out of high school and furious at the agricultural corporations that had crushed their parents' operation. The farm began to feel like something real instead of something theoretical. Rows of plants maintained by multiple people. Systems developed through trial and error starting to feel like actual knowledge. The kind of rhythms that suggested this might be sustainable long-term rather than just an extended exercise in postponing failure. Then came 5 years. September 2020 arrived with Marlowe barely recognizing the person she'd been in October 2015. That version of herself had walked out of Riverside with $47 and the bone-deep certainty that she was unwanted by everyone. This version stood on land she owned, running a farm that employed 3 full-time workers, engaged to a woman who made her believe in futures that extended beyond surviving the next season. The anniversary celebration was Cordelia's idea, but everyone contributed. All 4 Cooper siblings and their families descended on the farm, joined by what felt like half of Willow Creek. Amos Morrison brought his whole family. Margot Hayes organized the food. Even FBI agent Vance showed up, now retired but still invested in the case that had helped take down Robert Hendricks Jr. 63 people gathered on land that had been abandoned and left for dead 5 years earlier. The barn, rebuilt after the arson, stood straight and red and functional. The farmhouse had insulation and electricity and windows that closed properly. 30 acres of the property produced crops that fed people across 3 counties. The remaining acreage was in various stages of restoration, each section representing another year of planned expansion. Cordelia called for attention as sunset approached, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. 5 years ago, a young woman made a choice that brought our family back together. She returned what wasn't hers and proved that integrity still matters. Silas stood beside his sister. Dad died thinking his life's work meant nothing, but Marlo honored what he built and gave us the chance to remember why it mattered. Donovan added his voice, the brother who doubted longest. I was wrong about you. My kids call you Aunt Marlo, and that says everything that needs saying. When it was Marlo's turn to speak, she kept it simple. 5 years ago, I made a choice. Returning that money led me to discover I'd never actually been alone. 2 people I'd never met built me a home before I knew I needed one. Every day since has been about trying to deserve that gift. The celebration continued as the sky darkened, but Marlo slipped away as twilight settled. She drove to Willow Creek Cemetery alone, needing this moment to be private. Iris's grave was marked with a simple stone, the 247 letters buried at the base in a waterproof container. She sat on the grass beside the headstone, pulling a letter from her pocket. Words she'd written that morning, her own attempt to complete the conversation her grandmother had started 16 years ago. Grandma. She spoke to the stone, to the earth, to whatever part of Iris might still be listening. I read all 247 letters. I kept every single one. The evening breeze moved through the cemetery, carrying the scent of cut grass and distant wood smoke. You wrote that you'd never stop trying to reach me, that I wasn't forgotten, that love doesn't stop when letters don't arrive. Marlo unfolded the letter, her handwriting shaky with emotion. I want you to know, I found the home you built. I found the land you bought when I was 8 years old. I found William's farm right next to yours, and I understand now that wasn't coincidence. Her voice cracked, but she continued. You and William loved me before you knew my name. You fought for me when I didn't know you existed. You built me a future when I had none. She paused, looking at the fields visible beyond the cemetery fence. I made $38,000 this year farming. I know that would make you laugh. You always said I was too practical for physical labor. But I'm happy, Grandma. I have Silas, who's family in the truest sense. I have Lydia, who's going to be my wife next spring. I have community and purpose and land that means something because of what you sacrificed for it. The letter continued with the words she needed to say. Most importantly, I understand now what you were trying to teach me. Love isn't about proximity. It's about refusing to give up. It's about 247 letters, even when every one comes back. It's about buying land for a granddaughter you might never see again. Her final words came out as barely more than a whisper. Thank you for never giving up. Thank you for the letters. Thank you for the land. Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. I'm home now, Grandma, and I'm never leaving. She placed the letter in the container with the 247 that Iris had written, sealing them together. 2 women reaching across time and distance and death, completing a conversation that had taken 28 years to find its conclusion. 6 months later, Marlo and Lydia were married on the farm in a simple ceremony with 40 guests. Silas walked Marlo down an aisle of tilled soil, while Lydia waited under an arch woven from grapevines. Amos Morrison officiated. The vows they'd written spoke of soil and seasons, and the patient work of building futures worth inheriting. Lydia was 4 months pregnant, carrying a child who would grow up knowing the story of 247 letters and 2 people who'd refused to abandon someone they couldn't reach. That baby would learn early that legacy was built through choices rather than accidents, that love sometimes looked like persistence in the face of impossible odds.
Final accounting came as Marlowe sat on the restored tractor one evening in late spring, watching Lydia work in the garden they'd planted together. 6 years since buying the farm for $100. 5 years since returning $8,000 that could have saved her. 4 years since fighting Robert Hendricks Jr. and winning. The farm made modest profit now, enough to employ 3 people and sustain 2 families and slowly expand each year.
Not wealth, but stability. The kind that came from understanding soil and seasons and the 1,000 ways crops could fail or flourish. They'd never be rich doing this work, but rich had never been the goal. She thought about the metal box under the tractor seat, about the moment that had defined everything that followed. Finding money when she had nothing, and choosing to give it away because keeping it would have made her the person the courts had said she was. That choice had cost her survival, but given her identity. Legacy isn't what you own. The words formed themselves, understanding crystallizing from 6 years of learning. It's what you refuse to abandon. What you fight for when fighting seems pointless. What you build when building seems impossible. Marlowe climbed down from the tractor and walked toward Lydia, toward the fields they'd plant together next season, toward the future that Iris and William had believed in when she was too young to know futures were something you could build. The farm stretched around her, 87 acres of land that meant something because people had refused to give up on it. On her, on the possibility that broken things could be made whole through persistent love and stubborn hope. She'd spent 23 years not knowing she was wanted. Then she'd found a tractor with a hidden compartment, made a choice that could have destroyed her, and discovered she'd been fought for all along by people who'd never stopped believing she'd find her way home. Welcome home, Marlowe. The words were her own now, claiming the truth they'd always contained. You were always meant to be here.